Okay, welcome to the Korea Society. My name is Nikita Desai. I'm the Director for Policy and Corporate Programs here. It's my pleasure to welcome you all on St. Patty's Day to attend this session. We're discussing today the 4-year anniversary of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, also known as KORUS FTA. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Michael Beeman. Michael Beeman is Senior Advisor to the U.S.-Korea Business Council. The U.S.-Korea Business Council was a Van Fleet Award recipient by the Korea Society in 2011. Previously, he was responsible for trade and economic issues with Korea while serving as acting assistant U.S. trade representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC affairs at the USTR office. He joined USTR in 2004, and he worked on Japan and other Asia region trade issues for over a decade while he was there. He completed his doctorate in politics in 1998 at University of Oxford and has previously been a research fellow at Harvard University and the University of Tokyo. I'd like to thank the APEC Study Center at Columbia University for co-sponsoring this program with us. And I'd like to also finally introduce our moderator for today, our new president, Tom Byrne. He joined us last August from Moody's Investor Service. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all coming on, for all of you coming on St. Patrick's Day. I hope you didn't get bogged down in crossing Fifth Avenue as I did today, navigating the maze. But I wanted to start off just by throwing out some statistics to anchor the conversation, but not to get bogged down. So for Korea, this is of course Korea-U.S. Bilateral trade. The United States is Korea's second largest export market. It accounts for 11% of its exports, and that amounted to $71 billion in 2014. These are WTO trade statistics. Of course, China is about 1/4 of Korea's exports, twice as much in dollar value. On the import side, U.S. is not as high. It's number 4 if you include the European Union as a single entity. And so the South Korea imports $45 billion from the U.S. However, as we all know, the U.S. is a much bigger trading nation. I think in total volume, probably 3 times higher than South Korea. And South Korea is not in the top 5, both exports and imports, in the U.S. trade profile. Japan is number 5. However, I was told it's number 6 in total trade, not close to it. So with that frame of reference, that's statistical frame of reference, I'll ask my first question to Michael, and thank you for coming here, Michael. U.S. and Korea exports are the subject of much criticism when it comes to assessing the success of KORUS FTA. Can you speak to the tangible trade investment flows as well as the intangible institutional benefits or trade flows between the two countries?
Absolutely, and thanks very much for the invitation to come here, and it's a real pleasure to visit this office. It's the first time for me to visit this office here in New York, so thank you for that. Absolutely, I mean, our trade with Korea has become, I would argue, much more dynamic and much more broad in our economic and commercial terms since the FTA came into effect. The trade portion of that, which we always think of in terms of goods and services, most people think of it in terms of goods, but services is an extremely important part of that, has shown a good bit of evolution since the KORUS FTA came into effect. It has shown evolution in the sense that our exports to Korea of goods that are benefiting from the free trade agreement, directly benefiting through tariff elimination or tariff reduction, has been growing steadily, about 5% on average per year since the Korea agreement came into effect. And so we are seeing that directly. We are also seeing some very immediate impacts where tariffs fell immediately. We see great growth in trade, including manufactured goods, American manufactured goods, which are also showing continued growth in the market. Where there has been, frankly, a pullback, if you will, in our trade with Korea really has been primarily in some commodity items that have, commodity trade around the world is the prices have decreased substantially for many products. And there are three products in particular where we used to export in dollar terms a lot more than we do now. I'm not sure about volume, but in dollar terms, corn and coal and scrap metal, all of those have fallen precipitously in terms of global prices, if you will. And so, frankly, our trade overall with Korea, while we see growth in those products that have benefited from the FTA, good regular growth, we see good regular growth in manufacturing exports. We see one would argue, explosive growth in certain areas, of course, aircraft and aircraft parts, and in things like automobiles and motor vehicles and motor vehicle parts, grown almost tripled, if you will, since the FTA came into effect. But the picture overall has been kind of tempered by these commodity impacts, where have been exporting more and more, where the commodities have been a significant, but not the most significant part of our trade. Then overall, in terms of the benefit, the kind of intangible, if you will, parts of the trade. Services, I would argue, is both tangible and intangible because our services trade has continued to grow. Actually, that's where we've seen the most regular gains comparing goods and services. It's up about 25% since the FTA came into effect. We still have a surplus in this area, which is growing compared to the imports of services from Korea. Services is always a difficult animal to get your hands around because it measures certain things and it doesn't measure certain things. And this is where the intangibles come in, because there is a tangible services trade, but there is an intangible services trade, which is the presence of financial services companies in Seoul, and the fact that many more American financial services companies are increasing their presence. Legal services in the market, express delivery services, and these kinds of things, some of which are measured and some of which are not well measured. So it's been much more dynamic, and I think you continue to see a lot more direct participation by U.S. companies of all sorts, both traditional goods exporters as well as the service providers that are driving the expansion of our economic relationship with Korea.
Mm-hmm. Good. So I guess in conclusion, my next question is about investment flows, but the trade between Korea and the U.S. is better with the KORUS FTA than without it. There has been a boost. I don't know if that can be quantified, but there has been a definite enhancement of trade. You would agree with that, right?
Right. And I mean, the numbers will say services definitely, without a doubt, growing and continuing to grow every year, where we've seen the goods actually compared to 2011, the year before the FTA went into effect, and today, it was starting to increase and then flattened out last year. And I think an important point here is that to the extent that U.S. exports of goods to Korea have increased, but then fallen off, we're doing much better in terms of our goods exports, even in this rough environment, compared to the rest of the world's imports into Korea, basically. So we're not losing, if you will, from the slowdown in Korea's economy, but we're gaining in terms of keeping our share of market and growing it in many key areas.
Right. I guess that's the key point. It's the market share that is growing for U.S. exports into Korea.
Right. It's at least maintaining to the extent that Korea is slowing and all of Korea's imports are falling.
That's right.
The U.S. goods are continuing to maintain their own in the market in many sectors and growing.
Right. My second question is about investment flows. That's not, I guess, directly part of the KORUS FTA, but have there been benefits in terms of increased investment either from the U.S. into Korea or from Korea into the U.S. As a result of the KORUS? Is that something that can be teased out?
Absolutely. I mean, there's many aspects to why companies invest in other countries, and it's gaining a foothold in a market. It's expanding. I mean, there's just many dynamic reasons why. It could be building a factory, building a research center, to hiring more employees, et cetera. to sell services and that kind of thing. And I think last year, for example, at least the data I've seen, U.S. investment in Korea was up by about 25%, which is a pretty explosive growth, particularly given the slowdown that's been seen in Korea's economy. But a key part of investment, I think, particularly American investment going overseas, is predictability. Companies don't want to invest their money where they feel there are major risks, and I think this gets to the intangible issue as well in a big way, which is kind of the ability of the Korea Agreement to deliver predictability, to have rules that companies depend on and can rely upon, and have the means to enforce those rules before they make certain investment decisions. So obviously, Korea is an extremely dynamic place. There's a lot of opportunities, and that's a lot of reason why investment is attractive to American companies in Korea, to either to increase their exports or to increase their own sales, like insurance services or whatever that may be. But with the FTA, I just hear more and more from businesses how the FTA and the predictability that framework brings and makes it more possible for them to make longer term investments, and makes them more secure in doing that, if you will. Obviously, Korea's investment in the United States has been growing and has been very important here as well. I think the predictability here is, well, it depends on Congress and other things, but by and large, you kind of know what you're getting, I think, when you come into this market. And the fact that Korea has been dynamic, it's competing for investment dollars with China and with Japan and other parts of East Asia, and doing pretty well at it. And I think the KORUS FTA has helped to contribute to that.
Actually, I just thought of something. Korea and the U.S. don't have a bilateral investment treaty, is that right?
Well, investment really is covered by the KORUS FTA.
Right, okay.
Essentially, it's all brought into that. So there is an investment chapter, which basically gets at the same kinds of issues an investment treaty would do.
Okay, good.
Right.
Now, if I recall right before I think the negotiations with the United States on KORUS started before the negotiations with the European Union.
Right.
But the European Union concluded its free trade agreement ahead of the U.S. Can you speak about how that has affected trade with the EU, and maybe highlight some, if there are any notable differences between the two free trade agreements that Korea has?
There are some, but I think what primarily happened in the case of the U.S.-Korea agreement was finished before, as you mentioned before, the negotiations with the EU were finished, or the first set of negotiations. And there's a tendency in trade agreements for everyone to want everything else that everyone got from previous agreements. So they don't want to, to the extent the U.S. got new market access in certain areas or for certain products, Europe immediately wants that too, if you will, from Korea. So, and then I think the EU built on that a little bit, but there weren't any dramatically, I think, different areas. I think arguably the U.S. auto provisions with Korea, for example, really arguably, given safety standards and other kinds of things that were addressed under the agreement, did better than in some ways, because Korea recognized a number of recognized our safety standards for a pretty significant number of exports, for example. So there's not there are differences in terms of the timing of when tariffs are eliminated and that kind of thing. Obviously, agricultural trade is not as important for the European Union as it is for the United States, so I'm not really sure how that compares.
Right.
But overall, yes, there was a lot of comparing of agreements, if you will, that went on during that period of time to make sure both the EU and the United States both trying to make sure their exporters were not disadvantaged by the other's agreements, if you will.
Right. So Korea has the free trade agreement with the U.S., a free trade agreement with Europe, but Korea did not seek entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Wanted to ask you a couple of questions about that, but the first question is from your perspective. Why didn't Korea jump in on the TPP?
Well, it's hard to say precisely. I think the more I hear more frequently these days that in retrospect, I think there's some Korean officials who tend to believe that was they should have been there,
Right.
and they should have been more proactive in expressing their interest and expressing their desire to join the
Right.
negotiations before it became too late, if you will, to finish the agreement. And I've heard other theories that Korea, after having pursued so many FTAs and so many negotiations, and politically, domestically, was going under a little bit of free trade agreement fatigue, if you will. Domestically, it was kind of hard to think about launching off into a whole new world for a variety of reasons. I think that may have factored in. But I think it's also true that for Korea, by concluding with the EU, the United States, Australia, they had connected a lot of countries already that were important in terms of trade through their FTAs, and so maybe that took a little bit of the incentive off to push past any political concerns that may have existed to try and move into the TPP at that stage. However, obviously, we're continuing to hear that Korea is very interested in the future of participation. So, and obviously, it's a natural potential next, a member.
Right. What I recall is that Korea probably is the most FTA-intensive trading country in the world.
It's very,
in terms of its share of trade covered by free trade agreements. Japan is very far behind, I think maybe half as much as Korea's total trade covered by FTAs. However, Korea not joining the TPP, Japan is the second largest economy that would join the TPP. Korea's preferential advantages in markets with FTAs would be eliminated once Japan goes in. Is this a factor behind the thinking in Korea? What you hear in Korea on why Korea would like to be at the top, if not the first member to join the TPP after it goes into force?
I think there's absolutely something to that, but I think what the TPP model does is obviously a number of other attractive things that are important for Korea to look at as it continues to consider what it wants to do. One is the concept of the TPP is that once it's put into place, that it would grow, that it would become kind of the center of free trade in the Asia Pacific among all the countries, connecting all the countries. And tangibly, what that means is when you're an exporter, you have one rule of origin for all these countries. You don't have a rule of origin for China, a rule of origin for, or China would not be TPP, sorry, but for ASEAN countries or Australia or the United States. These are very, these take large legal departments at major companies to figure out how to take advantage of these agreements sometimes. With the TPP, you would have a rule of origin to export to throughout all these countries, for example. And that's just like can make a huge difference in terms of the utilization of these agreements and being able to take advantage of the opportunities available. So, I think it's not only the direct, obvious potential gains that Korea could get, but it's also being a part of a network that's growing and that's unified. And I think companies all like unified rules, if you will. And I think that's a very attractive part of the TPP for any other country as well.
Actually, a couple more questions.
Sure.
On TPP. How difficult would it be for Korea to join the TPP once the TPP goes into effect?
Well, here, there's kind of two issues there. Number one is how the discussion evolves in the United States, and both in terms of TPP as well as free trade overall. I think it's no secret that there's a larger voices that are out there that have been growing in the last 2 or 3 years about questioning the value of these agreements, et cetera. So there's that whole issue and how that evolves, and then but the United States isn't the only participant in TPP. There's 11 other members and 11 other countries with issues. But the intent of growing the agreement remains fundamental to the process through new membership. But second will be, at least speaking specifically to the United States, the decision to entertain bringing new countries in will be informed by a number of different factors. One, obviously Korea is a key ally, very important partner in the region on many levels. So all the strategic, arguments or their relationship arguments are all extremely strong with Korea. There will be, however, obviously a look at the economic picture, and to the extent that there are still some outstanding issues that need to be resolved with Korea, both as a part of the FTA, but more generally in terms of business environment issues or market access and other concerns, those will also be looked at very closely. What is Korea's track record under the FTA, and is Korea a reliable partner? I'm just saying that's what will be asked, if you will. I think there's many, and to the extent that the outstanding issues can be resolved, to clean up the track record will make it all the easier to be able to make that discussion easier.
Yeah. Can you go into a bit more detail on the track record? From the U.S. Chamber's perspective, has Korea's track record been good on
I think
adhering to the provisions agreement?
Well, if you look at the overall agreement, there are, obviously it's, over 1,000 pages of rules and provisions. So if you just look at it in totality, yes, the vast majority of all these pages of the agreement there's not been issues with them. There have been, however, some issues that have continued to crop up in a number of different areas from time to time. Some of which, are clearer KORUS concerns, and some of which are related KORUS concerns, if you will. And frankly, a number of them have been resolved. And any free trade agreement is going to bring up issues. There are always going to be issues to deal with, and there's very fulsome, if you will, mechanisms under the agreement to deal with a lot of these things. And they have been successfully dealt with in many cases, but not all. And there will be focus on those issues that where there are still real concerns. There's concerns in the areas ranging from financial services to medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Certainly, I think it's fair to say, kind of the evolving constant change in Korea's automotive regulations have been very frustrating for certain companies as well in the United States. And so there's a number of things some of which are KORUS or more directly KORUS, some of which are legal services. Actually is a new issue that's popped up in terms of concerns. So overall, yes, that doesn't mean it's perfect, and I think it's important to keep at it and to deal with these and move these off the agenda. That will be very important in terms of the political environment for Korea, for the United States to support Korea coming into the TPP, for example.
Right. In terms of free trade agreements that the U.S. has entered into, political opposition or political questioning of free trade agreements, the value to, say, to the American economy or to the American worker, how does KORUS stack up against NAFTA or any other free trade agreement we have? Is that something you can make an assessment on?
Well, as I say, there's the tangible and the intangible, if you will. I think the Korea agreement is very young, if you will. 4 years and 2 days is particularly in an agreement where a number of the provisions haven't. A lot of it is in effect, to be fair, but some is not in effect yet and won't be in effect as the tariffs are lowered over a period of time. For example, a great example today here in New York with people walking around on the street is beer. American exports of beer had faced a 30% tariff in Korea, but that was supposed to be staged down over 7 years. we're at, I think, year 5 of that, and our exports have grown substantially. I think about more than $1 million to more than $1 million a year as the tariff has fallen. But we don't know the full effect yet because there's 2 more years left to go before the tariff is fully eliminated. Now, I don't know about the green part. I'll leave that to food coloring aside. So there are these key opportunities that we don't know yet fully. But overall, I think certainly on the tangible side, we see these benefits coming. On the intangible side is where I think it's very hard to measure, but there's a lot there. And certainly when the Korea Agreement was concluded, it was broadly considered to be the highest standard and basically more or less the most comprehensive agreement of any the United States has ever concluded. So if you compare, there's qualitative and quantitative. Certainly on the qualitative side, it's it's just much broader and it covers a lot more than a NAFTA or many of our other trade agreements. Right. On the quantitative side, I think the story is I think it's fair to assess where we're at this point, 4 years later. But until the full thing comes into effect, I think it's a little hard to judge. We'll give a final judgment as to how it stacks up, if you will, one versus another.
Yeah. I think we can have ample time for questioning, but questions from the audience. But first, getting back to TPP, 2 final questions. What probability would you assign to TPP coming into force in the United States and then among all the partners? And then the second one is China. Will China enter the TPP at any time in the foreseeable future?
Wow, those are 2 very always risky to predict, right?
Well, you could speak on your own personal.
Yes, right. I think that's probably the best as a gut personal reaction only, not an institutional reaction. I mean, the TPP, without a doubt, is there are many reasons why it would really be I don't even know what to call it. It would be almost a failure in many ways of American leadership to not move forward in some way with the TPP. Now, as to how that happens and when it happens, I think that story has yet to be written. There is obviously a great deal of support for it, but there are certain concerns about it. This is a familiar story with Korea and our FTA with Korea, if you will, and how those concerns are worked through. Is I think it's difficult to predict. I think that eventually, yes, it will happen. Eventually sounds like it could be a long time. I don't expect that, but I think given the current environment, it's really hard to say with any kind of absolute certainty how that process will happen. I'm sorry, your other question was
China, but if I can just maybe put some words in your mouth. So it's greater than a 50-50 chance that TPP will.
I think it's definitely, I think it has to be greater than 50-50. Okay. I think but as to how we get there and what changes may need to occur to make that possible, I don't know.
Okay. And China, what are the dynamics there on China joining the TPP?
Well, obviously the TPP is open to the point of the TPP is to be open to countries that are ready to liberalize and adopt these rules at the level that the TPP has required. And I think it's fair to say that likely over time, as the TPP evolves, it's not only an issue of new members potentially. There's also been focus and attention on the possibility of adding new areas or new issues to the agreement as time goes on. So not only members would evolve, but the agreement would evolve. So it's kind of hard to predict there. There have been a number of areas where China has not shown that it's ready to live up to these kinds of standards through its negotiations with other countries or through the WTO and other things. So I think that discussion is still quite a ways off. And will take quite a bit more time to evolve.
Right.
Is it impossible? No. Is it possible? So it is possible, but The question is kind of when and how and under what conditions. I
Right.
think that's a discussion still for the future.
Right. Okay, good. And then turning back to the chorus for my final question. So looking out over the future, the next couple or several years, the evolution of this agreement, it's a matter of what's been agreed upon being fully implemented. I think you touched upon this, but maybe you could highlight again the big areas that need further work. And then finally, are free trade agreements what you agreed? Is they're finite, well defined, or do they get amended over time?
So in terms of the amendments, if you will, it depends. I can't recall much, if any, cases of U.S. free trade agreements being amended. In fact, in a sense, the TPP is amending some of our current free trade agreements by, for example, we have NAFTA with Mexico and Canada. The TPP obviously will include new provisions that essentially it focuses on labor and environmental standards, which has been a key part of the TPP and not as central certainly to NAFTA when it was negotiated. So there's an evolution, and the evolution has come through new negotiations that kind of superseded things that have happened heretofore, if you will. Right. So I'm sorry, that was your first question. Your last second. The first was.
Well, do they, to touch again on areas that haven't been fully implemented?
Oh, right.
Difficult areas?
Right. So I don't know. I don't want to make this a fully inclusive list because I'm sure we'll leave something off, if you will. But there have been continuing concerns in the automotive sector with some automotive regulations, and I should be really careful. Not all of these are necessarily our KORUS issues, and there's actually there's two ways to think about these. One has to do with what is actually a potential violation of the agreement, by letter, if you will. But there's also what we call in trade speak, measures that could nullify or impair, in other words, could undermine the benefits that the agreement should be delivering by instituting new rules or making it so difficult to take advantage of this market opening, if you will. So that you essentially don't get the access that was negotiated. So there's kind of two elements here to this discussion. Then there's maybe a third element, which is like the spirit of the agreement, or really kind of moves off into the area of what's good for the business environment overall, and is this consistent with a country that has a free trade agreement and is committed to open markets, which is a much more ambiguous part, but important. So issues range from like transparency of pricing for medical devices and pharmaceuticals. That remains a concern for a number of companies. One of the really kind of emerging issues that we hear a lot more about these days has been some of the conduct of the Korea Fair Trade Commission, both in terms of procedural fairness and the investigation process and how that is done, and as well as kind of the concern about some of the approaches that have been taken have looked in certain instances a little frighteningly similar to some of the approaches that China has taken, that the world is kind of outraged at, basically. So that's a new area of concern. There have been the legal services issue. Korea has moved forward with amending legislation to open that market, but it's put in because with which the EU-Korea agreement was supposed to provide for, as well as the U.S.-Korea agreement was supposed to provide for. There's a lot of concern about where all the other conditions that have been attached to that, as to whether or not that's really constitutes the third opening, if you will, of the legal services sector, if that's sufficient. And there are others too, but we've moved past a lot of some number of other issues that have been resolved regarding rules of origin and customs. That's continue to be monitored, but is improving. There are a number of things. In totality, it's not that many, but in terms of industries that are directly affected, or et cetera, they can be quite significant.
With that, hope you all, thank you so much for coming and hope you enjoy your St. Patrick's Day today. Please give a warm round of applause to our two panelists today.